Hello, Northern Arizona University. My name is Sarah Williams.
And my name is Darby Walker.
And welcome to Cut Lines and Deadlines.
The purpose of this podcast is to let our audience get to know the Lumberjack staff and primarily to give a microphone to college students.
We are a studied and talked about population, but our opinions and experiences are often undervalued.
Often, young people don't watch the news because they aren't meaningfully represented.
This podcast will have themed episodes ranging from public opinion to political activism that give the mic to college students involved with the episode's theme.
Some will be Lumberjack staff, others will be students or college-age people applicable to our subject matter. In our second episode, we'll be looking at exposure to graphic content and how it affects our ability to stay informed.
Does bad news sell? We will discuss the coverage of Charlie Kirk's assassination, as well as military propaganda, and the effects of live-streamed warfare.
Today, we have our editor-in-chief, Devin Legay, with us to discuss these topics.
All right, to start us off with the conversation, I wanted to ask you guys if you've ever seen graphic videos depicting violence on social media before.
Of course. I think that it's almost something that people in our generation tend to have in common, where we've been on these platforms since early adolescence, and as soon as we got access to the internet, we were seeing these kinds of graphic content. But in terms of the most recent example I can think of, the Charlie Kirk assassination, was a brutal video that was on everybody's feeds almost instantly.
Yeah, I remember when that happened, we were all sitting in the newsroom and we turned on like CNN and we were watching, and then somebody in the newsroom pulled up the video and was like, this is on social media like right now. And then I opened up my Instagram and the first thing I saw was the video. And I was like, wow, like that was real fast.
Yeah, and it almost as a journalist, I think we're like more in tune with this stuff than the average person. So we kind of have to like grade our exposure and how often we're, exposing ourselves to this stuff. But yeah, I mean, even like you said, as an adolescent, like we all grew up in the post 9/11 period. And like, I remember in middle school, there was like videos of beheadings and things like that going around, and kids who would like show them to each other as like basically just a shock content kind of thing, because everyone was so desensitized with just being on being introduced to the internet so quickly, I guess.
Yeah, it's like such an interesting concept that like the internet and social media, they have regulations to try to not have these things on their platforms, but a lot, like, as we're all saying, it's clearly not working. We're all seeing it. We've been seeing it for a long time. And, like, Associated Press and, like, journalism ethics, we talk about how we shouldn't post dead bodies with a story or, like, on the news because it's, like, that's a very traumatic thing for people to see. And so when we were watching CNN during the Kirk stuff, they cut right before any of the graphic things were shown. And I remember in the newsroom, a few of us were like, is that misrepresenting what happened? Like, all of us have seen that video. But CNN won't show the whole thing because of these journalistic ethics that, I still think are good and valid and that we should support. But, it could be misrepresenting stories. Like, a good example would be, like, the war in Gaza right now. Like, a lot of young people are seeing photos directly from the photojournalists there. And that, I think, has caused some anger towards like more traditional Western news outlets who don't show those photos and videos because it's not journalistically ethical. And I guess I was just kind of curious about your guys' thoughts on that as well.
It kind of comes with just people are angry about a lack of coverage in general. And I mean, journalists aren't even allowed into Gaza. So obviously there's, reasons to be angry that there's not enough coverage happening. But yeah, I think it like then creates this space where the only way to stay up to date and to actually stay informed is to go to these independent sources that often have extremely explicit content.
Yeah.
And there's just if you don't trust the mainstream outlets like that are supposed to come in between that content and you, then it creates the space where everyone just has to constantly see that extremely graphic content because you can't trust someone else to censor it, essentially.
Yeah, if the traditional news outlets aren't going to talk about it at the very least, then it encourages people to go find it on their own. And I found a study that was talking about specifically, it was a study of journalists who were exposed to, like, just like a study about journalists being exposed to violent images that are uncensored. And this was from like 2014. And the conclusion was basically like if they see a graphic image, that's already going to do the traumatic thing, but it's how often they see traumatic images. You know, so if you're going on your social media and every day you see these graphic images, it's going to wear down on you. And I've talked to a lot of young people who are like, I don't read the news right now because it's too hard. Like, everything is so upsetting, and I'm getting graphic images on my social media that they want to see, like, they want to be informed, but it's like, I think it's a lot of burnout for young people.
Yeah, definitely. I think about that a lot, specifically with like the idea of bad news sells, like, because I know so many people who say I don't watch the news because it's depressing, right? I'm sure we all know at least someone who says that they don't watch the news because it's too depressing. So I don't think it does. I think news that makes people angry sells, and that's not the same thing as like bad news. Actual bad news, like actual tragic news specifically, doesn't sell. Like, you have to essentially convince advertisers to be willing to have their advertisements next to this stuff. You have to like censor it and go through all these guidelines just to get that coverage out there.
Definitely. And with Gaza, it's an interesting discussion because a lot of the actual news, at least the mainstream American news that people were looking at, was denying the genocide or giving numbers that were not accurate. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where that photojournalism and video journalism, that foot on the ground reporting, really came in, because sure, our American news outlets are not telling the truth, but we can see the evidence that contradicts that. And I think it's kind of devastating that people need to see that carnage in such a vast amount to know that a genocide is happening.
Yeah. Well, reading a hospital was bombed and then actually seeing it be bombed, very different experiences. Mm-hmm. And important ones, like photojournalism, especially, is unbelievably important. And it's just an interesting ethical question. And
it makes me think about empathy, too.
Yeah.
I wonder a lot, if a lot of the things that were happening in Gaza were happening here, we wouldn't be seeing that footage, probably. Definitely not to the same scale, but also a single line describing any of that would probably impact people far more emotionally than reading that it happened in Gaza. And I wonder why that is.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, like, because I always relate it to, like, closeness of a situation, right? If something doesn't affect you, are you going to really care that much? And that's why I think photojournalism, especially with things like, or like your coverage of the uranium mine protests, like, I feel like people don't want to hear about that. They don't want to hear that Flagstaff is allowing this to happen and that Arizona isn't really doing anything to stop it. But having those stories out there and having, like, being like, you guys need to confront this and look at what these protests are actually about. It's like, the necessity of it all, but it, I think, causes burnout. And so there's a fine line that journalists have to ride. And it's a difficult line to see, I think, right now because of social media. Mm-hmm. But it is that dang phone.
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot when, in the same thing, like the protests that I covered for, not the uranium mine, but the copper mine down in at the San Carlos Reservation. That is really like, that's the crux of it. Like, how do you get people to continue to care? Because we know people do care. I don't know how much I'm really able to like change the minds of people who are actually like fully against, fully on the other side of it. But a lot of people do care, and the question is just, how do you get them to continue caring? How do you get them to show up each week, to protest, to sign petitions, to do whatever? And I guess, like the easiest answer is just like, you have to sort of make it entertaining, but that is much more complex in practice. it's easy to just say make it entertaining, but what does that actually mean?
And that leads into another idea that I was thinking about with like rage bait videos. I don't know if you guys have seen those much, but they're like either pretend or just like really dramatic videos of something that's not necessarily real. And I feel like journalism, sometimes we can fall into the rage bait titles just to get people to read the story. I feel like I see that a lot with like titles about Trump or just his administration. And I click on it and I'm like, what? And then I'm like, oh, I feel like you're really misrepresenting what's happening just to get me to click on the story. I don't know how journalistically ethical that is.
I mean, I can certainly connect that to the Charlie Kirk assassination. And I spoke about this in my most recent piece, my letter from the editor that I published a few days ago. But with the Charlie Kirk assassination, a lot of those initial headlines connected, for some reason, to transgender people. Because at first he was just speaking, answering a question about transgender mass shooters, which, just before I get into this, 0.17% of mass shootings have been committed by transgender people. So this is not a phenomenon.
Yeah.
But the initial coverage had to have transgender mass shooters in the lead or the headline, despite it having nothing to do with the assassination. And then from then on out, there was fabricated or misleading coverage that tried to connect trans people to that shooting, which is incredibly dangerous. It's scapegoating a community that is already so vulnerable. And the only reason these outlets were doing that was because that's how they get people's attention. People were already Googling that, so people thought, hey, that's how my article is going to show up. And that's devastating. It really speaks to the impact, the negative impact that journalism can have.
Yeah. The algorithm kind of destroying a little bit of that ethicalness. Yeah. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely an entire mechanism in place ready for to like place that blame. I think there's been an entire there's a whole section of the media that really went after gay people, and then later went after trans people a lot, whether it was calling them groomers or whatever, new sort of thing. Now it's before it was groomers and going after the children, now it's violence, and it's just very clear that it just picks up on that headline, right? That that mechanism is in place to pump out that bad news, I guess, or that news that makes people angry.
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
And skewed statistics. That's something that I always get really frustrated with in journalism, misrepresenting statistics, because stats are already so hard to get done in the first place. And then the way that journalism can sometimes entirely misrepresent a stat just because they need a headline. Like there was a Time article that I read about people drinking less, and it was Gen Z drinking less, and it was entirely based on a study done by some random website. And so it had no peer review, no process of double checking any of their work. And I felt like it was really weird to make an entire story based off of one stat in a online website. That skews and is misinforming people and leads to, and it's right, you're right, it's just so people will click on their story. And it's like, well, now there's a whole conversation about these things that should not, or I guess, yeah, people are going to have conversations about whatever they want. But the news cycle, including misinformation just to be talked about, come on, guys. That's some social media clickbait, rage bait type of thing. That's not news. Come on.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask a question to you both,
Please.
just since it's on my head?
Yes.
Yeah.
How do we as student journalists, one, make sure that we're properly informed when these news sources we're looking at already don't feel reliable to us?
Mm-hmm.
And two, how do we stop this cycle and ensure that we're not perpetuating this misinformation?
Okay. First question. How do we double check things? I always look into the reporter that wrote a piece if I'm a little curious about the process and stuff, because knowing about them, I find helps me understand maybe where they're coming from, why they pitched that piece, why they're the one writing it, that sort of thing. And I like to follow journalists. I don't follow news outlets. If I could pull up my Instagram right now, I could name off a few. But I know Rachel Scott. I follow her, and I like seeing what she does behind the scenes because it makes me feel like, oh, okay. Like she followed Trump around during his election, and there was a few times, like he doesn't like her, you know? That she asks questions that he doesn't necessarily like, and I like seeing that. And she posts about it every time she asks a question, and like seeing that sort of like behind the scenes of journalists make me trust them a lot more. Part of why we're doing this podcast, I think. It'd be cool if more news outlets did this sort of thing to let us know who we're reading or listening to and from. At least that's how I feel like I can trust things more.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, the first part of that question, like how do we stay informed, especially when like we're now required to like look at graphic content just to stay informed. I think for one thing, I set pretty clear boundaries of like I will spend, 20 minutes or 30 minutes a day just like watching the news, and the rest of the time I'm not, or like an hour or whatever, or like when I'm not at work, not researching things, I'm just not watching the news. So setting like clear boundaries on what you're consuming, because I think a lot of it nowadays it's really hard for people to differentiate between journalism and political commentary.
Yes.
Or just entertainment in general. I think it's all just lumped together.
Mm-hmm.
And so we consider a lot of things news that aren't necessarily news. And we see a lot of news in places that like it's not really the most effective way to get your news.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think legitimately just logging onto the Associated Press for like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Like the Associated Press app.
Yeah.
Not just like social media where you like see some of the posts coming from places.
Mm-hmm.
Is a really good way to stay informed. You can like compare that with independent reporting and with what is happening in your area and all that.
Yeah, I love like the BBC, and I know some people are a little more iffy, but I also read Al Jazeera pretty commonly, just because in my like poli-sci classes they were like, that's not a bad resource for the Middle East. Obviously take some of it with a grain of salt, but you can take the BBC with a grain of salt too.
Yeah.
So, but for like international stuff, that I have their apps as well. Love journalism apps. But to like fix this problem and like cycle of misinformation, I think it's hard, mainly because young people have to be interested in reading or watching the news. And right now, I think, at least from my experience, most people get their news from like social media, so TikTok or Instagram. And rather than bashing them for that, I do think we just need to adapt. If they're not going to read it, if they're not going to turn on the traditional news, then traditional news needs to meet young people where they're at. We need to post videos on TikTok. And actually, I do believe like a lot of media outlets are kind of figuring that out now, at the very least with TikTok. So, and I think everybody could really expand on that more. Like, you have to meet the audience where they're at. And that's the hard part of adapting these rules and ethics to social media, where the TikToker who isn't related to a news company can post the video of somebody being shot, whereas we can't. And you're kind of competing with that. But I think that it's a good competition a little bit, right? People can get both sides of the story, get news in different ways. I don't think like, what's it called, like citizen journalism? I think it's pretty valid. I don't know. Maybe that's a hot take for the journalism industry, but I think it's a good thing. It only helps us.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Like, I think citizen journalism should be a thing. I think we still have to be the ones to like check that work. Oh man, I totally had a point. I completely forgot.
That's okay. The train of thought leaves the station sometimes.
Yeah, correct. But yeah, I think what I've really been leaning towards and what I've been trying to do in my reporting is I see a lot of journalists or people who kind of would have become journalists, either going towards just full on strictly writing articles or making like videos on TikTok. And I think what I've been really trying to lean towards in the Lumberjack is like I want to be able to put out an article and then put out a video on social media, like a 60-second video that explains that article and that leads back to that article, so that I can cover both bases, so that I'm still getting that coverage out there. Because I think, I don't know, at the end of the day, like text-based reporting is still the best way in my mind to get information. Like you can actually check the sources yourself.
And there are studies on that.
Yeah.
There are.
Yeah.
Written journalism is, at the very least, like you said, and I think it also sticks in people's heads more, or something that I heard. Like if you read it rather than hear it.
Yeah. I mean, I bet that's true. For me, like I need to be able to like read things or like write stuff down to remember it. So, but yeah, like adapting, and I think adapting in both ways, right? Not like losing the resources that we have been studying, that generations of journalists have been building up. I think those are still really useful, not just forgetting those when we adapt, but like, using both of those methods.
I agree. Keeping journalists ethical on social media, a must.
Yeah.
Or it causes burnout, like we've been chatting about. So, yeah, I don't have any more questions for you guys. Any more thoughts on your?
I mean, I can continue off of what Darby was just saying, because I think talking about citizen journalism is very interesting, especially from the perspective that we're at as student journalists, which is we're in sort of an in-between place, because yes, we're under a publication, we have editors, there's somewhat of an institution, but also we're not professional journalists.
Yeah.
We're not paid, we're almost qualified, but also we're reporting on our own community. Oftentimes things we're reporting about are things that we're passionate about or that our friends or neighbors are involved in. And I think that's something that's very special.
I agree. Katie was like, yeah, when I worked for the Hopi Reporter, people would stop me and be like, oh, I loved your story this week. Or she'd get calls from the families of the like football team and was like, good story. I liked it. And that I feel like is the big piece of community journalism, at least that I learned like when I was a writer for you. I went to like way more things in Flagstaff than I do now, because like I was going and writing for stories and actually talking to people and learning about the events. And yeah, I feel like, yeah, it's a I didn't really think about student journalism and citizen journalism being very similar, but it basically, yeah, there's a fine line right there that honestly they're like you said, they're the same thing. And that matters. We're valid, guys. We're a valid news source. We're all professionals.
Well, I appreciate you both for letting me be a guest on this episode. It's been very fun, very exciting. And
Thank you so much for coming on, Leo. We enjoyed having you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being here. And yeah, I think you brought up some great talking points. It was awesome to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.
Go read Leo's newest letter from the editor. It is very good.